And welcome everybody to our second follow webinar focusing on sharing financial intelligence across borders by financial intelligence units. This is part of a series of 3 webinars that the ERC project follow, led by Professor Marieke de Goede, together with the research priority area of the University of Amsterdam, Global Digital Cultures are organizing. Today we have 3 speakers that have been working a lot on the financial intelligence units, which are those actors that are somehow bridging the information between the private companies such as bank and other financial actors and the judiciary, so courts, and are somehow in a not only bridging but also pivoting and brokering positions themselves. And today, bringing together people that have been at the forefront of this research for several years, we will try to understand how their cross-national relations are developing and how this kind of digital information are moving across Europe and possibly also at international level. I will now leave the floor to Professor Marieke de Goede that will say a few words about follow and resituate our topic of today. Marieke.
Very much, Rocco, for introducing us and welcome everyone. We're doing a series of 3 webinars to conclude the project that we call Follow. And in that project, we seek to follow the suspicious transaction from transaction to trial. So we sort of look at the path of the suspicious transaction as it makes its way from the bank through the financial intelligence unit, through the police and the judiciary, and sometimes the court. Today, we're focusing on financial intelligence units, which are rather secretive organizations, but incredibly important when it comes to financial intelligence. They increasingly play a role also in gathering data, in sharing data, in analyzing data, and in initiating criminal proceedings. So I'm very, very excited with today's speakers who have specialized and who have done, I think, some globally unique work in looking into the practices of these rather secretive organizations. So I'm very much looking forward to today's talk and discussions.
Thank you very much, Marieke. Before starting, a little bit about the rule of the game. So each of our speakers will have around 10 minutes to present their work and their thought about this common topic. We will start with Peter, we'll move to Phoebe and then to Anthony. I will introduce each of them and I will ask you to already drop your question in the chat room. After the presentation, we'll open the conversation, and the goal is really to have a kind of a vibrant conversation about this with all of you. So let me start with Peter. Peter Lagerwaard is a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. He works in the framework of the project Follow, and he holds a bachelor in anthropology and a research master in social sciences. For his PhD, he studies the daily operation of financial intelligence units and how this relatively new security organization collect, analyze, and disseminate financial intelligence. And his work focuses on how FIUs coordinate their operation transnationally and how they share financial intelligence across distance and difference. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rocco. I will just start screen sharing. Okay, well, thank you, Rocco, for this introduction, which saves me to introduce myself. Thank you for the Global Digital Cultures for organizing this, and of course to Marieke de Goede, and also for the practical work from ASMA and ESME. Thank you all for making this possible. So I will present today the presentation on the coordination of financial intelligence units across distance and difference. So you can already see the hyphen with coordination. It's not a spelling error. We will come back to it later in this presentation to why it is spelled in this particular manner. So I will just begin straight with my core argument to get the message clear across. So FIUs are very different organizations. As many people probably in the Zoom meeting already know and realize. So they're not only different in their sizes and financial capacities, but also in their daily practices of financial intelligence and the practices of doing terrorist financing and anti-money laundering. So I argue in a nutshell that FIUs coordinate their activities not in spite of these different practices. For example, as you will see, defining, reporting, numbering, and measuring anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, but exactly because these kinds of security threats, such as terrorist financing, provide a shared frame of reference that enable them to communicate and share their intelligence. So I will come back to this, but this will be the core message of the presentation. So Marika already introduced the project Follow. So the project Follow is built around this chain of security, in this case, a chain of financial security. So last week we had the webinar on the banks, so on the left, who monitor transactions. And as we saw last time in the last webinar, we also saw the role of technology and experimentation. So banks monitor their transactions, and they filter out unusual transactions. And these unusual transactions, they send them to the middle of the chain, the financial intelligence unit. So the financial intelligence unit, it's the part which I study specifically. I have conducted fieldwork, interviews, document analysis for 4 years for my PhD from 2016 to 2020. And I have paid, as Rocco already indicated, particular attention to the transnational dimension and how FIUs share financial intelligence. So from the FIU, they filter and they analyze the unusual transactions further. They declare them suspicious, and they send them to the third part of the chain, the law enforcement or the prosecution, and eventually, possibly, the suspicious transactions will appear as evidence in court, which will be the topic of the third webinar of this series. So financial intelligence units and their transnational dimension. What we can see here on the left is a map from the Egmont group of financial intelligence units. So the Egmont group of financial intelligence units, you can see the logo here. It's the global platform through which the FIUs cooperate, and they offer the software systems for them to communicate with each other and also to share their financial intelligence. So as you can see here, there are many dots, and each of the dots is a financial intelligence unit. So you can see that almost all countries across the globe have a FIU, except a few African countries, Iran and North Korea. All countries are part of the Egmont group. So what is interesting about the Egmont group is that they commit to share their intelligence as freely as possible, which means that these different FIUs from across the globe engage in almost daily communications and sharing of financial intelligence. And they are with 166 FIUs, which is quite a lot. So this brings me to sort of this fascinating question. If you have 166 organizations from across the globe, how do they coordinate their activities in this diversity across their difference and distances? So what I use to understand the situation of this grand diversity of FIUs cooperating, I use the term of coordination. So you might ask, why not just use the term of cooperation? I use the term of coordination. So there are three interesting things. Let's start with the mysterious hyphen between the co and the ordination. So what this indicates is that it's a coexistence. So it's a co-relationship between different actors. So of working together, it's a co-effort. It's also coordinates, so geographical coordinates, which is an interesting feature, because where are the different actors located in space in particular, and the regular understanding of coordination as coordinating elements. So I borrowed a term from Anne-Marie Mol, anthropologist Anne-Marie Mol, who studied and just turn briefly to her work, and then you can see how I try to use it to understand the FIUs. So she studied in a hospital a disease of sclerosis. So she studied this one disease, and she studied how different practitioners in this one hospital enacted, so sort of did or do this one disease. So she studied how this disease was enacted in different ways by surgeons, pathologists, and patients. So what she means with an enactment is not necessarily that this one disease is singular and has different interpretations. So there is not one disease, but this disease lives in with different actors in different ways. So there are different realities of this disease, which together make this one disease. So the disease is not singular, but it's multiple in her, to use her terminology. So just to look at this quote, which I think is really interesting to think about coordination. She says that as soon as attention shifts to the coexistence of different realities or logics or modes of ordering, which I find is a very nice way of framing it, the question arises as how these different realities hang together. So then going back to the case of the FIUs, can we really say that they have different realities, right? It's quite a grand claim to say that FIUs live in different realities. So to make this case, I give an example of terrorist financing. So what you can see on the left, or what you can see on the left, it's a graph from a Europol report where you can see the total terrorist financing reports which were sent to FIUs in 2013, 2014. So just have 10 seconds to look at this row where my mouse is now at, and have a look at these numbers. So on the left, you see the countries, the abbreviations, such as here Germany, Czech, Estonia, France, and have a look at these numbers. And these are then the terrorist financing numbers. So they absolutely do not make any sense, I would say. They're completely different. And for example, Estonia, which is this one here, it has more reports than all the EU members combined. If you look at France, it's 200. If you look at the neighbor from Estonia, here Latvia, it only has, it has 0. So apparently terrorist financing does not exist in the neighboring country. So what this shows is actually that terrorist financing, but it's not, these numbers do not necessarily show that these terrorist financing numbers are a result of in one country there's terrorism or in the other country there's no terrorism, but they show that these numbers are a result, are a construction of the different types of standardizations, categorizations, definitions. For example, I mean, what's a terrorist depends on whose view, different ways of counting, different ways of numbering, different ways of measuring, and that eventually these different kinds of practices from each of these individual FIUs result in these different numbers. So, for example, this is a quote from the Europol report. It's not something that practitioners do not realize, right? This is a quote from the Europol report in which they state that Estonia's high figure is in fact misleading and does not indicate that Estonia is a hotbed for terrorist financial activities. In fact, the Estonian figure reflects the fact that the FIU automatically records transactions to and from certain jurisdictions as terrorist financing. So the Estonian example shows that if another country does not record these automatically to certain jurisdictions, you do not have these kinds of numbers. However, having said that, like Mol has shown, these are not only imaginary realities. These are very real realities with also very real effects. So also within their countries, they resonate in certain graphs. They resonate in documents. They resonate in bureaucratic and political decision making, and of course in matters of security decisions. So it would be tempting to say that the statistics don't do anything and that the numbers are flawed. But that would be to miss the point, I would say, of what these statistics do. So I argue that we need a shift in thinking, that these differences actually enable something, that enable the FIUs to bridge their differences and to exchange financial intelligence and to communicate with each other. So here we see a quote from FIU the Netherlands. So for this, we need to specifically go into one detail. And it's from the FIU the Netherlands, and we just saw the statistics. And here they say the following: the fight against terrorist financing must extend across borders. To this end, FIU the Netherlands exchanges requests for information with fellow FIUs. In 2019, a total of 50 requests were received from FIUs related to terrorist financing. And in 2019, FIU the Netherlands sent 34 requests for information related to terrorist financing. So we can see that this concept of terrorist financing, far from being hollow or not existing, even though the different realities are existing, they hang together in a certain way that it leads to exchanges of financial information in practice. So
Peter, 1 minute left.
Okay, perfect. I have one slide left. So this was just an example of terrorist financing. On the left, you can see the number of exchanges and reports that the Egmont shares. So in 2016, it was 22,000, 2018, 23. So we see that this coordination is gaining strength. And we see that there's a total of, well, 28 million reports and 35 million reports. But in these reports, terrorist financing is just one category. I could have made a similar analysis of this coordination by looking at anti-money laundering, for example, of other types of crime. So to answer the question, so how do FIUs coordinate their activities across distance and difference? It's not in spite of their different practices. So what we saw, the defining, reporting, the numbering, the statistics, the measuring of AML's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. But it's exactly because these kinds of security threats, such as terrorist financing, provide a shared frame of reference through which the different realities relate, and FIUs can communicate and eventually share their financial intelligence. Okay, so thank you everyone for your attention and for listening.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you also for giving us the feeling of listening to a radio due to some problem with the sound, but I think that it was possible to follow you through the presentation, and we will come back to your talk. It's an honor now to present Dr. Foivi Musakiti. She's a lecturer in law at the Department of Law and Criminology of Royal Holloway, University of London. She holds a Master of Law from University College London and a PhD from Queen Mary University. Her doctoral thesis was entitled Financial Surveillance, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing in the EU, the case of financial intelligence units, and it examined the impact of the legal framework that governs the production and dissemination of financial intelligence on the fundamental rights to privacy and data protection. Foivi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you also so much for inviting me today to talk about FIU cooperation. I have been following Project Follow for a couple of years now with great interest, so I look forward to the discussion. All right, so allow me to start with a quote from last year's European Union Security Strategy, where the Commission said that cooperation and information exchange are very important tools to combat crime and terrorism and pursue justice. And that to be efficient, it needs to be targeted and timely. But to be trusted, it needs to be used with common safeguards and controls. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I will try to illustrate that in the case of FIU cooperation, this balance between efficiency and safeguards has not quite been achieved, and that is primarily for two reasons. First, because the legal framework that underpins the activities of FIUs in the European Union is minimal, and it is very complex, and therefore is not adequate to regulate the cooperation between them in a manner that safeguards the data protection of individuals. And second, as we will see from some examples, because data protection is very often sidelined when it comes to FIU cooperation for the sake of operational convenience. So let me start with a few things about the legal framework. Peter kindly explained what FIUs are and what they do, so I won't go into that, but I will say that the European Union's legal framework on financial intelligence may be described as a mixture of some very flexible legal provisions that leave plenty of room on member states to exercise their discretion when it comes to shaping their FIUs, and a mix of mandatory requirements. So most of the flexibility, as some of you I'm sure already know, relates to the legal status of FIUs. That's why we have police, administrative, judicial, hybrid FIUs across the EU. Now, their core functions are set out by EU law in a compulsory, but yet rather open-ended manner. So their modus operandi also differs quite considerably across the EU. At the same time, however, the EU legislator calls upon these very different authorities, calls upon them to cooperate to the greatest extent possible, right, despite their differences. But the legal framework, the minimum level of harmonization of the legal status of FIUs and of the functions of FIUs that EU law currently provides is really not sufficient to ensure that data protection is safeguarded. And that is for several reasons, and I'll give you some examples today. We can't cover everything, but I'll give some examples. First of all, because of the lack of harmonization of the legal status of FIUs, it is currently, there's a big ongoing debate about the data protection framework that should govern their operations. In particular, it's not entirely, member states and policymakers are really not in agreement as to whether FIUs across the EU should be subject to the general data protection framework that we have in the EU, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, or to its law enforcement counterpart, the Data Protection Police Directive. So even though FIUs do belong in that broader policing sphere, right, they do in a sense sit in a gray zone between administration on the one hand and criminal justice on the other. And nobody seems to be able to decide, as far as the legal framework is concerned, where their nature lies. So if you look at the debates, the European Commission has argued many times that they do qualify as public administration and that they should be subject to the General Data Protection Regulation. On the other hand, several member states, and from my discussions with FIU officials, are not convinced by this argument, and they have actually subjected their FIUs to the Data Protection Police Directive. And it might also be interesting to some of you that are looking into the typologies, it might also be interesting for you to know that, at least from my research into a few FIUs I've looked at, the legal status of the FIU, whether it's police or administrative, doesn't really determine the data protection framework that is applicable. So we have FIUs like the United Kingdom's FIU, which is a paradigm police type FIU that nonetheless applies the General Data Protection Regulation and not the law enforcement directive, which would sound more logic, so to speak. So what I'm trying to illustrate by this is that at a time when FIUs are becoming more and more interconnected, the data protection safeguards that are applicable to them are uneven, and it's becoming increasingly complex to determine what is the data protection framework that should govern the information exchanges between them. So there is a considerable legal uncertainty in that regard. And it's quite interesting to see that when there were discussions among policymakers as to whether they should establish a single European FIU, one of the positive outcomes out of such a structure that was mentioned in policy papers would be that if that were to happen, we would finally have better control and better accountability because of a single data protection regime. Now, this is to be seen what's going to happen with this idea. So to move on, a second example with the data protection issues that arise when FIUs cooperate has to do with the way they carry out their core functions, right? It's not just the data protection safeguards that are uneven among FIUs, it's also their modus operandi, as I said, that differs. And really the way that a particular FIU carries out its core functions has very important consequences for the privacy and data protection of individuals. It really does differ so much. There are some FIUs that are often described in the literature as buffers because they're structured in a way that guarantees a separation between the analysis of suspicious transaction reports on the one hand and the criminal investigation on the basis of these reports on the other. And these structures sends a strong message that suspicious transaction reporting is not necessarily linked to criminal proceedings, and also better safeguards the data protection of individuals. But there are other FIUs at the same time that don't quite adhere to this strict separation. In particular, the EU FIUs platform has observed recently that there are some FIUs, particularly the ones that belong in the police type or are housed within a police organization, that actually they merge the analysis of suspicious transaction reports and the investigation on the basis of these reports, or they involve external individuals from policing authorities during the analysis of suspicious transaction reports. Again, by calling on FIUs to cooperate without any obstacles whatsoever, the EU legislator here is prioritizing operational convenience on the one hand, of course, but on the other hand, it's really undermining some of the data protection safeguards that are guaranteed by those FIUs that maintain a strict separation. Data that has been deliberately kept outside the criminal justice sector from one member state is being shared with the FIU of another member state. Well, it will be used for purposes, it might be used for purposes other than simply analysis, which is not only in violation of the data protection principle of purpose limitation, it's also in violation of the anti-money laundering directive. So a third example that is from very recent times has to do with FIUnet. So FIUnet, for those of you who don't know, is the decentralized computer system that facilitates information exchanges between FIUs, like a virtual cloud that connects their databases. Now, this was maintained for a couple of years by the Dutch Ministry of Interior, but eventually the decision was made to move it to Europol, and that Europol would be the technical administrator of FIUnet. And for that purpose, Europol would have to process FIU data. This happened in 2016, and an agreement was reached to that end and so on. But suddenly, 3 years later, the European Data Protection Supervisor came to the conclusion that Europol, in its capacity as the technical administrator of FIUnet, was actually processing FIU data without a valid legal basis to do so, and in violation of the Europol regulation. That is because in order for Europol to legitimately process that data, the individuals whose FIU data were processed would have to qualify as suspects. However, because FIUs act before criminal proceedings have begun, they do not qualify as suspects, and therefore there was not a valid legal basis for the processing of that data. And this is just another example of how the operational is put before really the rights of individuals and the data protection of individuals. Now, one final thing I would mention, we don't have time to get to that today, but it's quite interesting, and Peter mentioned the Egmont Group, is that the data protection challenges really that arise in the context of FIU cooperation do not end within the EU. The legal framework that governs their cooperation, the cooperation of EU FIUs with their counterparts outside the European Union, which, as Peter illustrated, is very, it happens all the time, is so unclear that a very recent questionnaire that was distributed to FIUs by the Commission, the majority of member states failed to provide any explanations as to how their transfers of information to FIUs of third countries were regulated or justified. So this was a final thought. I wanted just to open it up because there's even more perhaps difficulties when it comes to cooperating with third countries. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Phoebe, for the great presentation. I'm sure we'll come back to the question of the international dimension beyond the European Union. A pleasure to introduce Professor Antonia Missell. He's currently an associate professor at Sciences Po Bordeaux and an affiliate professor at the Université de Montréal. He's a researcher at the Centre Émile Durkheim and an associate researcher at the Centre for International Studies, Série Sciences Po Paris, and the Center for Sociological Research on Law and Penal Institution. His work focuses on the contemporary transformation of policing, on international policies against economic and financial crime, and on mobility control technology from a comparative perspective, focusing in particular on transnational circulation of people, capital, goods, and digital data. Thank you very much, Anthony. The floor is yours.
Many thanks, Rocco, and it's of course a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the organizer, and I will directly going to share my screen as well. So normally you're able to see my screen right now. So the title of my presentation is Denounce and Not Punish Issues in International Cooperation. So what I want to do is basically to present a really recent work I did and I'm still working on for an article with Kilian Chaudieu, who is a PhD candidate. And the issue is really to relate to the Follow project. So as mentioned by Marike, from transaction to trial or from transaction to conviction, and to see to what extent the issue of international cooperation or coordination, as mentioned by Peter, is important in a way or another. And as you will see, one of my objectives is also to bring back the issue of social classes. And I will try to show that. So maybe first, it was already mentioned, but how to understand money as security data or as policing data. What I want to say is that when I try to work on anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing, for me, and of course for you, for most of you, it's not just the fight against illicit financial flows. It's a specific form of policing. So a specific form of, as you mentioned, policing. What is specific to policing is the operation of surveillance coupled with the threat of sanctions for deviance, either immediately or by initiating penal processes. And financial policing is a specific form of that, because the idea is to monitoring financial transactions in order to be able to punish criminals. And follow the money, of course, as you know, and as mentioned by Marike, is a specific chain of security. You have different actors from the banks who have to monitor and, of course, to denounce, to report suspicious transactions. Then, of course, the financial intelligence unit who basically receive such denunciation and transform it in intelligence for their different partners. Could be justice, could be other intelligence services, national security, police, tax administration, and so on and so forth. So still part of that, what is important for me at least, is that right now financial policing is about officially all illicit financial flows, from terrorist financing to tax evasion, from organized crime, money to insider trading, corruption, and so on and so forth. What I want to say here, it's from white-collar crime to nuclear proliferation, from white-collar crime, from, in France at least, a minister of budget to the Islamic State. So what is important as well in this financial policing, it can really tackle and put in jail some people really different socially, from really little drug traffickers to the prime minister or the president of a country. And what I wanted to study about that is, what is the case? What is the relation between denunciation and conviction at the end? Who is denounced mainly, and who is convicted mainly? And is there a coherence between the beginning of the continuum, which is denunciation, and the end, which is basically normally conviction for money laundering, for instance? So to do that, we got access to the data of the Swiss Financial Intelligence Unit. So we got access basically to 10 years of denunciation from 2004 to 2014. And in Switzerland is, as you can see here, a bit more than 12,000 denunciation, 12,000 suspicious activity reports. And basically what I will present right now is a kind of confrontation between what is denounced and what is punished, and what kind of conclusion we can bring about that in terms of international cooperation, be it between financial intelligence units or maybe between other actors, between the police and so on and so forth. So I will try to be quick, of course, but to divide my presentation in 3 main points. So first, to present a bit financial policing in Switzerland, then to present the data, so in terms of punishments or criminal convictions, and in terms of denunciation, because normally, of course, it is coherent. And then I will try to bring the issue of social classes. Is there any difference in terms of social categories denounced and punished, for instance, between little drug traffickers and ruling elites, for instance, before the conclusion? So first, financial intelligence in Switzerland. So you have the main figure here for the last 15 years, basically. So the most important would be the blue line and the orange one. The blue line is basically what is reported by financial institutions, mainly banks, but not only banks. So you can see the evolution, and in orange, it's basically what is filtered by the financial intelligence unit, which is called MROS in Switzerland, and then delivered or disclosed to the partners. And mainly in Switzerland, that would be the prosecution authorities. And a specificity of Switzerland is, you can see for a long time, the difference is quite thin. So you have more than 80% of the denunciation which are disclosed to the security or the justice partners by the financial intelligence unit. So that's a kind of specificity. And you can also, for the ones who know the number of suspicious activity reports in other countries, it's quite low in Switzerland. So I can get back to that if you want during the Q&A. So second element, distinction, and I use the word of Michel Foucault, between illegalities and delinquency. In this case, delinquency is used when a criminal qualification is applied successfully. So basically, when something is convicted and someone is convicted. And illegalities is mainly the case when there is a resistance to apply a criminal qualification, when basically the one who is denounced is not convicted at the end, to put it really simply. So I will start on the contrary way, so with the punishments. That the punishments, the conviction, criminal conviction for money laundering in Switzerland for a specific period of time, and I can also get back to that during the discussion. In Switzerland, you have almost 30 different crimes who can be related to money laundering. So you can go to jail for money laundering of drug trafficking, fraud, corruption, tax crime, and so on and so forth. That's here what is condemned. So you can see, as I mentioned, 30 different crimes, but you have one, drug trafficking, which basically represents more than 50% of all the conviction. So you have really one really important. 30 crimes, one more than 50% of all the conviction for money laundering. And another one which is important for me is basically corruption. And corruption is in the others category. So the one is, it's so small that you put a category with different crime, and it's basically between 0 and 23. It was impossible for me even to know if there is at least one conviction for corruption money, basically. So that for the punishments. And so we got access to this confidential data about denunciation, and we try to basically compare. And here it's a bit different, as you can see. So the one who is the most denounced as a criminal category is basically fraud. But fraud is very large with really very different stuff. So it was difficult to work on this one. But the second one is corruption. And actually, after our study, so after 2014, it has become the first one. So the main suspicious activity reports in Switzerland right now would be in corruption, which was at least a surprise when we did the study. And if you look, or you try to look for drug trafficking, it's basically here, not at all the first one. So to remind you, 50% of the conviction, but only 6% of the denunciation. And with regards to corruption, 0%, almost 0% of conviction, but more than 12% of denunciation. So you have a gap here, a discrepancy, which is quite interesting to understand, because normally the denunciation at the end are used to condemn, to put people in jail, to go to trial, and so on and so forth. And the one which is the most important for conviction is not at all the most important at the beginning with the denunciation, and the contrary with corruption, not at all important with regards to conviction, but really important in terms of denunciation. To continue on denunciation, what we do, we also try to see what are the amount of money related to the denunciation. It's another way to compare, basically. So with regards to, and it's only the denunciation transmitted to the prosecution authorities. So after the filter, after the work of the financial intelligence unit. So the ones who are considered really important and really serious relevant by the financial intelligence unit, sufficiently important to be sent to the prosecution authorities, basically. And you can see that, so globally during the 10 years period, it's a bit more than 19 billion Swiss francs. So basically we can say 19 billion euros. And the first one by far is corruption, 5 billion euros, basically. And if you look at drug money, it's basically here, drug trafficking, it's 94 million. So you can see the discrepancy, 5 billion, 94 million. Last part of my presentation before the conclusion, of course, it's crime categories. What we wanted to do is to try to do a bit of sociology with the database. So to try to situate socially the ones who are denounced. Because of course, we all know that you can have political actors in relation to drug trafficking, for instance. And what was really useful for that is a specific international law category, which is the politically exposed person. As some of you probably know, politically exposed person, PEPs, is a specific category created by the UN Convention Against Corruption. And basically, to be a politically exposed person, you have to have prominent public functions. So you can be the president or senior officials of national companies. You can be prime minister, political actors in Switzerland nationally or internationally. You can be part of international organization, NATO, the EU, or the UN, or you can be in relation to these people. So wife, husband, children, associates, and so on and so forth. And we try to see where are the politically exposed person with regards to the suspicious activity reports. And basically, it was not a surprise, but they are mainly in the corruption category. So the ruling elites, they are denounced. So the category is only between 2010 and 2014. And you can see with regards to the number, a wide majority are related to corruption, which is not really surprising. And you have other category, which is really important in terms of percentage. It's arms trafficking and abuse of power, but the number, the absolute number of denunciation is quite low, basically. And if we look at drug trafficking here, you have basically nothing. So the ruling elites are really related to this, let's say, economic and financial crime and mainly political corruption. So the conclusion, it's in this case, it's a kind of paradox. Of course, you have people going in jail after denunciation, but the one who are the main denounced, the ruling elites in relation to corruption, are also the least convicted, at least in Switzerland. And the one who are not at all the main part of the denunciation, drug traffickers, are the one who are really by far the most convicted. So how I can relate that to the issue of international cooperation between FIUs. So that was the question we had basically at the end. How to understand that? How to understand this kind of differential management of illegalities in which a significant part or a significant fraction of dominant classes can no longer avoid being denounced, but still avoid to be convicted and basically to go to jail. And one of the hypotheses we have, and I will conclude on this element, is about the lack of international cooperation between FIUs and between police and justice. Basically, in the case we studied, the drug trafficking, which is condemned, it's a really local drug trafficking. So it's in Geneva, Lausanne, Zurich, mainly by migrants, so Albanese and so on, but really little trafficking. So basically, the crime which generate money is done in Switzerland, and money laundering is not quite complex. Basically, it's money laundering with restaurants and so on and so forth. So quite easy to detect. In the case of corruption, basically the corruption is not in Switzerland, it's abroad, but the money laundering then is in Switzerland. So if you are a prosecutor in Switzerland and you want to convict somebody for corruption of money, first you have to prove that there is a crime at the beginning. So you have to ask for international cooperation to say, okay, I'm sure that there is corruption over there, and then I can convict or I can prosecute for money laundering. But basically, all or main of the this kind of investigation stop because there is no cooperation in this case. So they are not able to prove the corruption at the first case, and it's impossible then to convict for corruption money. So you can see how international cooperation is a significant issue in this case. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I believe that the three different interventions show different perspective actually on international cooperation among financial intelligence units. And what I found very amazing always when we focus on this form of cooperation is that it seems to exist and not exist at the same time. And this pushes us to better understand, as Peter was saying at the beginning, how it exists, how it comes into existence, despite the fact that when we look at the figures, we can see that they do not operate in the same way, or they may not even share the same understanding of what is, in this case, a terrorism a financial operation. In other cases, as Anthony was just mentioning, there may be a lack of support in cooperation that does not permit to punish, so to push further the denunciation. And as FIU was mentioning, nevertheless, we know that data are circulating and it's very difficult to grasp how these data are going to be protected and what are going to be the safeguards. So there seems to be still, or actually already there, some impact on fundamental rights. And this is also what our research and follow-up has shown. I see that there is already a first question from Sangeeta Kosvami. Sangeeta, if I may, would you like to ask yourself the question? I think that we have enough time for you to intervene directly, if you feel so.
Thanks, Rocco. No, it was more of sort of an observation than anything. I really enjoyed Anthony's presentation along with all the others. And I know you've looked at it, Anthony, on an individual level when you talk about denunciation and conviction, but just, as a practitioner working, in a nonprofit organization, I think we feel this very acutely at an organizational level, because nonprofits and those who work for them are often criminalized in many parts of the world using this very same sort of terrorism financing framework. So I'm wondering whether, you plan to extend this to look at it more at an aggregated level, so not just individuals but also organizations. Thanks.
Should I reply now, Rocco? Yeah. Thanks a lot for your question. Actually, I tried to do it earlier on this issue, and in terms of let's say discrimination or specific prioritization on NPOs. The issue was not so much as I saw it in terms of criminalization at the end, but mainly in terms of exclusion. So what I basically saw is on specific cases, the NGOs or even the money transmitters in relation to migrant workers can be excluded by the banks directly. Because they are considered too risky and not really interesting financially for the bank. So they do their cost risk analysis and they would say, okay, they are considered as high risk, so we have to monitor them really strictly. And of course, it costs money. Is it worth it? And for them, in some cases, it's not. So that's the first case. And the second case, sometimes they do suspicious activity report with regards to NGOs, and they consider that after 1 or 2 or 3 suspicious activity report, you have to be out. Not because the suspicious activity report are relevant, but the politics of the banks would be 3 denunciation, you're out. So you have this issue, of course, because NGOs are considered as high risk. So it's not so much in terms of conviction or criminal convictions, but in terms of exclusion right before within the financial institution, I would say, as I saw it in my research. Thank you.
To some extent, what kind of the risk in your speaking about, Anthony, is a form also of punishment. And do you see something similar to this kind of the risk, you know, in case of corruption, that the same person after 3-4 alerts is the risk, even if it's part of the ruling elite, as you mentioned
it? No. So that's one of the main differences, because in the case of corruption or in relation to financial or political elites, most of the times they are way more interested or interesting in terms of business for the bank. So they are still part of the clients. And what I did not mention in my paper, in my presentation, but it's part of the paper I try to finish, is how they are denounced. For instance, in the case of drug traffickers or NGOs, they are denounced because of financial surveillance. So basically, the banks found the suspicious or the suspicion activity alone because of algorithm, because of surveillance, and so on and so forth. In the case of corruption, for instance, it's not at all the way they do it. It's basically because of external information. Somebody told us. So somebody could be just the media. They open the newspaper and see the political elite in the journal convicted for something. So maybe they knew it before, but in this case, if they don't want to be prosecuted with the guy, they prefer to denounce him. So even here, you can see the difference in the way they are denounced. So of course, that's a big difference, but in terms of exclusion, they are not excluded the same way as the NGO, for instance.
Thank you very much. The floor is open, so if you have a question, please just raise your hand or make yourself visible and throw your question.
I can, yeah, if there's no
Please,
immediate questions, if there's no immediate questions, I can jump in, but I don't want to, occupy the floor. So please, everyone, feel free to bring in your questions via the chat or otherwise. I wanted to ask, especially Peter and Voivi, if you can say a little bit more about the political stakes of the things you are talking about. So I think, you did an excellent job, Voivi, of showing, the different data protection frameworks and how there is disagreement on which framework applies. But I think for many people, the work of the FIU and the impact it has on our everyday lives remains very abstract. So I wonder if you can say a little bit about the implications of choosing one framework over another, or the various juridical contestations you looked at, and how does it actually affect us? Like, what is the politics of that? And also for you, Peter, you showed about this coordination and how these huge differences exist between how FIUs actually work in practice and how they report. And there's this, drive to standardize, but obviously it doesn't work very well. But again, for you as well, if you could say something about the political stakes and how it affects, how it affects each of us.
Thank you so much. So I think you make a very good point, but it's not just about the different data protection frameworks, and perhaps I didn't emphasize this enough. It's also the fact that the EU legislator really hasn't explicitly told FIUs for very basic things through the legislation. So what is analysis, how they're supposed to do it, or for how long are they supposed to keep data in their databases? So some very simple instructions, if you like, are missing from the EU-wide legislation. And these instructions that are missing, obviously the national legislator has filled in the gaps, right? FIUs developed a bit de facto over the years. But they do have such a big impact on our privacy and data protection. You look at FIUs, I'm based in the UK, such as the UK FIU, which is a policing type FIU. But if you look at how they process data, who they share, the multitude of authorities they share their internal database with is astonishing. It's a very long list of authorities they share the suspicious transactions, even before specifying whether the reporter's suspicion is reasonable or not. So there was even a parliamentary inquiry about this, and the members of the House of Lords were astonished. They were saying, but you're keeping a database of suspects. How can this be in our times? And there's more than 1 million reports there, and they keep them for a decade. So, but then you go to another member state, for instance, and you see very different practices. Even though the EU legislation is the same, you see them adopting very different practices, perhaps way more privacy-friendly practices. No, we don't share any of our suspicious transaction reports with anybody. We only share the results of our analysis, and that is it. Nobody accesses our database. So there's so many different logics out there. I only looked into the UK, Greece, and Luxembourg. So during my PhD, but I'm sure that there's so many different practices across the EU, and the impact on the right to privacy and data protection is different depending on where you look at, really.
Peter, thank you for you.
Yeah, so to prevent my voice from being a radio or a robot, I put this, and I hope it's better. Well, Voivy's answer was already actually excellent. And well, maybe I can say a bit, for example, in the Netherlands, if a reporting entity reports to the FIU, it comes firstly in a database of unusual transactions, which includes in 2019 more than 2 million, and it can stay there for 5 years. So it's already in this database for 5 years. It's not accessible for other people, for other law enforcement agencies. Then the FIU conducts analysis, and then they filter out some of these transactions. For example, in 2019, around 40,000, and they end up in a database specifically with suspicious transactions. And they can stay there for 10 years, and they can stay there for 10 years, and they can be shared with other FIUs, and they can be shared with other law enforcement agencies. But what's indeed at stake here is that these transactions, there hasn't been an intervention by, for example, a law enforcement agency or judiciary. So no lawyer or prosecutor has looked at this information and declared it officially suspicious, but it's the FIU who declares it suspicious. So what's then the political stakes of having well, let's say the different realities, as I call it, and I think Voivy showed it as well in the different data regulations which are in different places in effect. So the moment when this data moves from context, so it moves from location, from, for example, the Netherlands to, well, let's say France, or let's say Switzerland, to take Anthony's case, because probably maybe there are also some transactions from the Netherlands in between these statistics. Then it changes these kind of contexts, but then also perhaps it can stay in a database where it can stay for 10 years or 20 years, or I don't know. And as Voivy pointed out, then the moment when you go beyond Europe and you start exchanging, for example, what the Netherlands said concerning terrorist financing, that they changed information with 50 countries, which must mean that it's also beyond the EU. Then there's data which comes from people who are not officially suspected. Without their knowledge, the data shares to other FIUs across the globe. And that's indeed because the data regulations are different, but also because the whole different enactments of how they do financial surveillance are different. Yeah, so I hope this answers the question to some extent.
Thank you, Peter. I see that Carola has a question. Carola, please.
Hi, everyone. I had to switch screens for a second. Good to see you, and thank you for this super interesting input that you gave. I was just wondering about something that you may have heard of, and which kind of maybe would invite you to reflect on another aspect of the work of FIUs, or maybe it's not part of the work of FIUs or should be avoided, which is the fact that sometimes data does not flow and that it's not filtered and not functional. So in the case of the German FIU, there's a huge discussion about it, frankly, a scandal, that the FIU has not given any leads and has not filtered or transferred suspicious transactions to the authorities. In the case of Wirecard, it's a big scandal of a big company, financial infrastructure company, that basically was based on big fraud and money laundering schemes. And the FIU had leads on this for quite some time, but it failed to provide them to the authorities. So, and this has all been revealed in a recent parliamentary inquiry. And so only now, it becomes apparent that essentially the FIU became a dead end to some extent. So I was wondering if there, if we're not quite sure, or the parliamentary inquiry also is interested in the international cooperation of the German FIU and questioning if this is actually working better, while the German cooperation or the inner German cooperation is not really working. So I was wondering if you have also, some experiences of, the fact that these, that we assume that there is cooperation and there are data flows and that we are very much, we think about data privacy a lot, but also the fact, that this is also sometimes non-functional for many reasons, which may be technical, but also called, management reasons and management dysfunctionality, so on. So there are lots of reasons why things just can go wrong at some point. And I was just wondering if you have any, cases of this and also how that maybe reflects in your specific research.
Thank you very much, Carola. Anthony, maybe, or?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Carola. Pleasure to see you, and thanks for the comments and the question. Actually, as you could see with regard to Switzerland, mainly everything is sent to the authorities, so it's not a good example with regards to your case. But in Canada, where I did my main research on financial intelligence unit, I basically saw the contrary about what you mentioned, saying that it's an issue in terms of proactivity and reactivity. So in Canada, the financial intelligence unit called FinTrack received a lot of data, like 25 million reports per year. So it's quite huge. It's not just only suspicious activity reports, but also with regards to money threshold. So after beyond $10,000, for instance, it's automatically sent, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so they did their analysis, and they try to be proactive, saying that, okay, we have a fantastic case with our analysts, we will send to the right, really relevant security partners. And most of the case, the reply of the partner was, oh, thanks, it's fantastic, but it's not our priority. We don't have the human resources to do that. So thanks, but no thanks, and we will not use it. And at the end, it was really difficult for the FIU in Canada to justify even its raison d'être. So to justify itself in terms of budget, because at parliaments, they say, okay, but you are not useful at all. Nobody uses your financial intelligence product, basically. So they changed their minds, and now they are just only reactive. So they wait for the partners to say, okay, we have an investigation on that. Please, have you something in your database? But it's really tautological. They only look for in their database what the other ones want, and what they want, and what the main clients want. And the main client would be the federal police, and the federal police is all about drug trafficking. So we get back to the same issue. They find out in the database, and they say, okay, so the national main issue is drug trafficking, so we have to continue, and so on and so forth. Of course, you have terrorist financing, but you have this dimension. They only look for what the other wants, and so it's impossible to change that and to change the main priority with regards to dirty money, basically.
Thank you, Anthony. And every time, indeed, I realize how much intrusive is financial surveillance in our life, and the amount of years and the amount of data that are collected, and for so long they are collected. And yet, I think that what is fascinating of this case of mass surveillance to some extent is that we see also how difficult it works when we want to bring it back to our understanding of a democratic law enforcement and justice, and actually just doing security from a more efficiency perspective, as FIU was mentioning in the European agenda document. Are there other questions? Otherwise, I have a couple of questions actually, but I would prefer to give precedence to participants. Peter, please.
Yeah, if there are no questions from the participants, that is. I would like to follow up on the question from Carola and going to Anthony again, because there was a question I had as well about the international cooperation from Switzerland. So what I know from the Swiss case is that it's also not a part of the MROS is not a part of the EU FIU platform, for example, and it's not a part of the regulations. So I was wondering, because you found that the international cooperation is lacking there, so this is how it's following Carola's question of where are the blockages, right? And I was wondering, is your finding in this case, in this context, purely limited to the Swiss case, or would you argue that this international cooperation is also valid for other European countries? Because in my view, the Swiss FIU and Swiss situation is a bit different compared to the others. That's also maybe why you got access, right, to all these transactions.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, Switzerland is not part of that, not part of this kind of EU framework. But basically, I did a few years ago this report for the European Parliament Committee on the Panama Papers, and it was basically on the cooperation between financial intelligence units, and you had many elements of obstacles about that. And in the case of Switzerland, for instance, let's say you are in Netherlands and you know that the money flows to Switzerland. And you ask, okay, dear colleagues, please, do you have any information with regards to that? In many countries, they will directly ask to the banks. So the Swiss FIU cannot do that. So they only reply if there is also a suspicious activity report in their own database, and which is quite unlikely. So in many cases, you have this difficulty in terms of cooperation. So in relation to FIU's presentation, you can see there's differences and this difficulty of cooperation. So Switzerland, but what was interesting in the research of Switzerland is to say how the Swiss case, which is always really criticized when you think about money laundering, most of the time, one of the top 3 countries you have in mind would be Switzerland. And what was interesting in our case is that basically the lack of transparency was not where it was supposed to be. So it was not so much in Switzerland, but basically with the other classic partners, and would be Italy, Netherlands, France, Brazil, and other countries. And actually, even the Swiss FIU on this point was quite happy with our critical conclusion to say, oh, look, it's not only us, it's also the others. So.
Thank you very much. If there are no other questions, I have a question actually for Foivia. I think that your insight about the data protection regime that applies to FIU, it's amazing. Like it's mind blowing from a data protection perspective. Yeah, I want to read more. But at the end of your presentation, you were speaking about the FIU net, and if you may elaborate a little bit more on that, if you have 1 minute for that.
Sure, but this was quite an old case, right? The idea was initially, and it's very difficult to find out more information about this. The only way I could access information was through the minutes of the meetings of the EU FIU platform, which are not very comprehensively written, so you need to do a bit of digging. But the idea was that it shouldn't be the Dutch ministry that would be the technical and maintain this IT infrastructure. They should move it to Europol, and the idea was that not only would Europol technically maintain it, but also in the long term there would be operational synergies, right, between FIUnet and Europol. So they did have aspirations about that embedment of this decentralized network into Europol, that they would be able to exchange the data with Europol or cross-match their databases and things like that. But long story short, the embedment of this IT system, which I don't know, I'm not an IT expert, I don't know exactly how it's structured, but the embedment into Europol proved quite complicated, and FIUs start asking questions in the meetings. Who is going to be able to access our data when this happens? Are we going to lose control of our FIU data? Some FIUs, to their credit, mentioned that, well, during the analysis phase of the reports, data should move from FIU to FIU, not from FIU to law enforcement. So what are we doing here? So they did, there was a couple of reactions from that perspective. So they did ask the opinion of the European Data Protection Supervisor, who then looked into, I suppose it was an agreement, which is not publicly available, between Europol and FIUnet, and came to the conclusion that there was no valid legal basis for the processing of that personal data, of that FIU data by Europol. And I can send you more information, but if you look at the Europol regulation, Europol can process data for the purposes of facilitating information exchange between member states, but that information has to relate to people who are classified as suspects under national law, which arguably the European Data Protection Supervisors and others came to the conclusion that individuals who have been subject to suspicious activity reports are not yet suspects, right? So Europol doesn't have the authority to legitimately process that data. The European Data Protection Supervisor banned Europol from maintaining FIUnet, and I think now it's being maintained by the European Commission until we get this EU FIU structure, which I don't know what it's going to look like, but that is the idea behind it.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. Thank you very much, Peter and Anthony, for your presentation. I think that we have to come to a conclusion. It's 15:15. We know that a third webinar will be soon presented to you, so stay tuned on our website. And before closing, I wanted to thank not only our speakers, but also the people that made this possible. So Asma, Sidine, and Monica, thank you very much for your hard work in bringing this together and bringing us together. Thank you very much. And goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.